So during the debate between David Wood and John Fontaine, after the initial back and forth during the question and answering portion, David decides to use a technique that I originated. That is to question the Muslim and demand that they produce some evidence of the original Quran. I did this in a debate that was videotaped between I and Shadi Lewis that took place in LA in California. So the Christian will claim that there is no corruption in their Bible. Like David Wood will claim that their Bible is the same Bible or same scriptures that were revealed to the prophets and messengers. In order to get away with this, they play a reverse Uno card and ignore the fact that the Bible, even according to Christian theologians and scholars, is corrupted and full of interpolations. In fact, you have a whole entire science of textual criticism which has the goal of reconstructing the original text written by the biblical writers. And at this point in history, many textual critics have given up on the idea of ever reconstructing the New Testament Bible. David asked John over and over again about the Torah. Dear audience, what you do not understand is that the oldest manuscripts of the so-called Torah and Tanakh are from the Septuagint, the Greek interpretation and translation of the Old Testament. The Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, is a later invention coming from the 8th and 9th century. That's AD or CE. There is no full copy of the Torah Tanakh that dates back to the 1st century or even beyond. What you do have is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which contain fragments. And what scholars have found based on these fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that there are multiple different versions of the Torah. You don't get a full, complete Torah until almost 1,000 years after the 1st century, AD CE, which is the Aleppo Codex, which was partially destroyed in 1947. The next manuscript is 1000 CE. And after that, we're talking 1225 CE. This comes after Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, let alone Jesus, peace and blessings be upon him. So it's just a flim-flam to demand that a Muslim apologist or a da'i produce a intact Quran and Injil that is without interpolations and corruption. First of all, the Quran is claiming there's interpolation and corruption. It would be upon the Christian apologist to produce this intact Injil or Torah. David Wood's Bible doesn't come into existence until the 5th century CE. The oldest gospel, which is Mark, has a very low Christology. And generally, that's created or written in 70 CE after the Jewish and Roman War, after the destruction of Jerusalem. We're talking 40 years after the time of Jesus, peace be upon him. Not to mention, you're not getting a divine Jesus, peace be upon him, a divine logos theory, let alone the Trinity, out of Mark. David Wood, if he was challenged to prove his divine logos Trinitarian beliefs, will most likely quote out of the Gospel of John, written around 100 CE, but some scholars even put it as far as 120, and even later than that to 170 CE. Again, neither John nor Mark or any of the 4 Gospels date to the time of Jesus, peace be upon him, and his disciples. Contemporaneously, along with John and the other Gospels, you have what I mentioned previously, the Gospel of the Hebrews, which many scholars call a Hebrew or Aramaic version of Matthew, used by the Aramaic church, Palestinian Christians, which we know were people who held to a dynamic monarchialism or adoptionist theology, i.e. rejecting a divine God-man, rejecting divine logos theory and doctrine. And despite, as I said this previously, that the Gospel of the Hebrews is quoted by early church fathers, that gospel has been lost to the world. So what in the heck is David Wood talking about? No, David, please stop using my techniques and my arguments, because they're pseudo and misinformation, brother. You can't demand Muslims produce a lost gospel and pretend like you don't know they're lost gospels that date to the same exact time the gospels that you hold to were written and being used. Gospels used by Aramaic-speaking Palestinian Christians who held to a completely different Christology than you, who existed before your divine logos Trinitarian Christology came into existence, before Tertullian was ever born and even started speaking about a triad. And who still existed when the Council of Nicaea was convened and the Roman government instituted the Trinity as official doctrine? Who still existed afterwards or were persecuted by the Orthodox Catholic Church? And who many fled to Arabia.